So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Thursday afternoon with Mark and Mark. Hello, Mark. Dr. Mark McCaldin, our clinical executive director. Afternoon. Mark's our clinical executive director. I'm the managing director of MPH Group, and we've been doing these 1 hour sessions on a Thursday afternoon from 3 till 4 during the whole of the period of the pandemic, really just to try and help people with discussing various subjects around health and well-being as it relates to them whilst on furlough, and as we've started to look at the issues that impact on businesses getting back up and running. So we hope you get something out of the next 20 minutes. One for the diary for the future, we're talking to Lizzie Simmons on the 30th of July. Lizzie is a British Olympic swimmer, very encouraging, motivational speaker, and she's volunteered to come on board and have a Zoom call with us to talk about lots of aspects of how we can motivate ourselves and our health and well-being. So look out for that one. Follow us on our social channels, and it'll be a first come, first serve to bag your place on the call with Lizzie on the 30th of July. So for today, we are wrapping our series up by talking about the factors that need to be considered by businesses when they get back up and running. As we know, people are coming out of lockdown now, and we're opening up the doors to serve people and to get businesses doing their usual stuff, which is fantastic. So we want to kind of conclude our chat today just considering some of the occupational health and well-being factors that businesses might want to start considering when they open their doors. So let's kick off with a general question, Mark, just to get things going. As I say, we've got about 20 minutes or so, so hopefully we'll cover off some useful points. So we know that many businesses are starting to open their doors and put plans in place to be able to manage a lot of the guidelines that the government is putting out there at the moment, and that's causing some difficulties for some businesses, and for others it's perhaps less difficult. You know, depending on whether you're in manufacturing or finance or you're running a small coffee shop, everybody's got different pressures that they're having to deal with. But we're dependent on getting our people back into the environment safely for them to be able to do their work. So there's lots of talk at the moment about being COVID-19 compliant within businesses. And I just wondered, from a general occupational point of view, what is that generally all about? What are we talking about when referring to businesses being COVID-19 compliant in its broadest sense?
So there's a government publication called COVID Secure, which is essentially a bullet list of issues and safety precautions which an employer must put in place in order to make their workplace sufficiently secure to allow their employees to come back. And my understanding is that they're required to display a declaration that they are COVID secure, that they've taken all the steps that they possibly can to make sure that the workplace and the environment that their employees are returning to or have already returned to complies with the general guidance for employers under the Government Secure publication. Now that covers a variety of sectors, and the actual specifics of the guidance are different from sector to sector, because what's required in hospitality will be slightly different from what's required in healthcare, which will be slightly different from what's required in manufacturing, etc., etc. But generally speaking, it's a way of ensuring that employers have done their best to ensure that the risk of spreading COVID within the workplace is minimized as far as it possibly can be, and that the health and well-being of their workforce are protected when they come back to work and start, and as they have done, start to come off lockdown and off furlough and start to resume their usual occupations.
Yeah, perfect. So we're talking about, you know, the measures around social distancing and the 2-meter rule, and the government currently is looking at whether the rule should be relaxed and it becomes a 1-meter rule. Of course, guidance and scientific guidance is changing all the time, which is half the difficulty with knowing exactly what we should or shouldn't be doing. And I think we'd probably be saying to businesses that they have to build into their plans the provision to be flexible around guidance and to move with the science and to move with the recommendations, and that it isn't going to be a one fit for all. As you say, there are many different sectors out there all trying to do different things. I know some businesses are putting up screening and tape on the floor and signage on the walls and sanitizers at various key points to try and ensure that people coming into the business can do the basics of washing their hands and keeping clean. So there's a lot of basic stuff, I think, in the COVID secure guidance that should become the kind of the basic bread and butter, but businesses should learn to adapt and change as we go through the next few months. I mean, I guess off the back of that, one key consideration is that we are not expecting, certainly as an occupational health provider, we're not expecting to come out of lockdown and then for businesses to suddenly be up and running at full capacity and to return to business as normal very quickly. It's going to take probably best part of the year before people really get back to some level of normality because of the change around the state of the virus and issues around the vaccine. Will there be a vaccine? Will there not be a vaccine? And maybe that's another good place to go. If we're looking at the vaccine itself, I think we hear people saying, well, really, until we get a vaccine where we can inoculate the population, then we're always going to have to entertain some level of measures in the workplace to limit the spread of the virus. Whatever the infection rate is, the risk will always remain whilst it's in the population. So from that point of view, what do we feel about the likelihood of a virus, of a vaccine being developed to help put this one to bed? Do we have a sort of a clinical perspective, or is there a clinical rationale about why it's so difficult to create a vaccine for the virus from our knowledge of other viruses?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very difficult, and without going into the science in too much detail, I think it's a balance sometimes between the level of investment and the level of determination that we have as a society to develop a treatment against whether something is biochemically feasible. And right up until this point in time, there really hasn't been much need to develop a vaccine against coronaviruses, because most coronaviruses are common colds and they don't cause a great deal of trouble. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of SARS-1, and then we saw the emergence of MERS, and now we've got SARS-2, COVID-19. And those viruses are very different. They cause much greater levels of illness and fatality than we've seen with the coronaviruses previously. It's a matter of debate and discussion why that is happening and why these viruses are becoming more virulent and more troublesome. But at the same time, I think there's probably no doubt that we will end up with a vaccine that has some benefit. It's really difficult at this stage to say whether we'll get a vaccine which is 100% protective, or whether we'll get a vaccine that is partially protective in some groups of people for some length of time. There are some extraordinary things happening in the world of the pharmaceutical development of vaccines, both in terms of the technology and what can be achieved. But also recently, AstraZeneca has said that they have already started to manufacture their particular COVID-19 vaccine, which is the one that's under trial in Oxford, at risk financially, in case it works, because if it does work, they want to roll it out for no cost, in terms of effectively being cost neutral for them, profit, I mean, as soon as they possibly can once the vaccine is proven to be effective. Now, that's almost unheard of. We've never had the situation where a large international pharmaceutical company would go out at risk to develop and start manufacturing a product before they were confident, number one, that it worked, and number two, that it was going to get used. But the reality is there's so much determination to find a vaccine that works, and perhaps a bit more confidence that they've got something that's going to be effective than we would have had pre the levels of technology and computer analysis that we've got now, that we're into a slightly different era of biotechnological development and sophistication. However, you're right, we don't know for sure yet whether we're going to get a vaccine which works. We don't know what quite that vaccine will do in terms of the immunity that it generates. So it might give us immunity for a year, and rather like flu, we might have to keep coming back and have booster doses. It might give us immunity for 10 years. We just don't know. We're in the first few hours of what's going to be a very long history of our human interaction with COVID-19. And it's just difficult at this point in time to say where we're headed with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So understanding that from a business leader point of view is really important, because it therefore then starts to imply, well, what does that, so what does that mean for me as a business leader and my staff that I'm responsible for? Even if you're dealing with small organizations with, half a dozen people, through to, larger organizations employing thousands of people, that there's got to be some level of understanding as to what does that mean for me as a business.
And the overconfident position is to say, oh yeah, this is no problem. The scientists are going to create a vaccine. The vaccine will solve the issue. And before, 6 to 12 months is up, we'll be back to working as normal and everything will be perfectly okay. I think that's an overconfident point of view. And certainly businesses, managers and leaders and owners will need to develop a much more flexible and open-minded approach, which is to say, okay, what we're reading in the press and what we understand from the development is there's a chance of a vaccine. That vaccine might do a great deal of good and it might be fantastic and solve many of the problems associated with COVID-19. However, we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that actually it's not that great. It takes a very long time to develop. It takes even longer to become widely available to all of my employees in my SME in the northeast of England, or my large manufacturing company in Scotland, or wherever it might be. And therefore, realistically, what we have to do is learn to live with COVID for the time being, because certainly at this point in time for the foreseeable future, there are some greater challenges in maintaining our staff health and well-being and productivity before the possibility of a vaccine actually arrives.
Absolutely. So then we start to get into the interesting area of, the ethical stance that businesses should be taking when trying to address the occupational health and well-being of their people. And there will be those businesses who will be probably, quite nonchalant about the risks in the workplace, and there'll be those who will take it very seriously and go to the nth degree to try and protect and put in measures to limit the spread of infection in the workplace. And I guess it'll be everybody in between too. And that's just something we're going to have to see how that pans out and what the impact of that is going to be on employment in the workplace. Because one of the obvious factors that we're certainly considering here, even as a small organization, is, well, what happens if we start to open up and then someone comes back in and they do pick up the virus and you end up with a little hub of infection within your workplace? Very quickly, irrespective of what's happening in the wider community, you could end up with a bubble of infection in your workplace, which, if not properly managed, could potentially be quite impactful on your business's productivity again. And of course, there will still be government guidance sitting above that, perhaps through track and trace, and individuals then being tested positive and being asked to self-isolate for a further 14 days until they're clear, all of which again will have an impact on the ability for people to return to work. So I know from our side, we've been considering, well, how do we advise businesses to manage that, and what measures can we put in place to look after it? So I suppose, with what you said at the beginning, there is the COVID secure guidance, which deals with the basics. But I think probably what we're starting to say to businesses is, look, you need to find a way of looking at how you can manage, knowing the status of your employees, knowing the risks that apply to your individual employees around their general health status, in just the same way as you would if you were looking after them from a general occupational health point of view. But now we've got a whole nother dimension at play here, which is perhaps going to be a bit more dynamic. It's going to have a different impact. It's going to affect, absence and presenteeism in the workplace in a different way. What are your thoughts on what's going to be different around the medical management, if you like, of a virus in the workplace as compared to how things were pre-COVID?
I think, for somebody who is positive and is ill, it probably doesn't make very much difference. They're sick, they need to be at home. The difficulty comes, and I think we can envisage that it's going to be really frustrating for employers who are just starting to get their workforce back to work and are just starting to feel that maybe productivity is picking up and perhaps the opportunities for some financial recovery are beginning to show themselves. It can be frustrating for them if some of their workforce are contact traced and are told, you now have to self-isolate at home. You can't go to work because you've had contact with somebody socially who has tested positive, but there's nothing wrong with them in terms of their own health. And that's new territory, really, for an employer point of view, to be told, we're taking your employees out of circulation for your company at the moment for 14 days. on the basis that they've had contact with somebody who might have the virus. They're not necessarily themselves sick, but they are at risk. And that's really, really challenging. I don't know that. I think the answers will vary depending on what sector we're talking about, or at least the suggestion, the solutions may vary. You might encourage employers to start thinking about how they would have discussions with their employees about working from home. And if it is possible to work from home whilst you're asked to lock down because of a potential COVID contact, during those 14 days, if you're fit and well, but you're just self-isolating, well, why couldn't you work potentially? You could dial in from home on an internet link, or use cloud or whatever, and perhaps participate in meetings, or do some development work, do some administration from home. If you're not poorly, there's no reason for you not to try and do some form of productive work. Clearly, that would be very difficult if you work in a manufacturing role, or if you work in a hands-on role where you're in construction, or you're doing something in an engineering capacity. That's totally different. And for those employers, it could be extremely troublesome, particularly if there are fluctuating levels of the virus within different localities within the country over time. So why would we expect there to be a flat level of COVID throughout the UK affecting absolutely everybody equally? We wouldn't. We'd expect there to be pockets geographically and pockets within time. And as that happens through the course of the rest of this year and into next year, we are going to find people being traced and advised to stay at home in pockets and in groups, and those bubbles, if you like, of infection and restriction are going to be quite disruptive, aren't they? I think they're Absolutely. Going to cause significant problems.
Yeah, and with that, of course, when people are told to go home, until it's known whether they are positive or they are carrying the virus, that's going to have an impact on their immediate family as well, and their possible work routine, kids going to school, etc. So I guess because of all of that, we've as an organisation, and it's early days for us too, but we're trying to respond with the times, and we've started to evolve our offer to businesses to help with producing a means to access testing. So we do offer PCR testing, antigen testing, and antibody testing through to all of our clients at the moment, and that's all in line with government guidance, and is readily available to people, because of course at the moment we've got PCR testing for the virus. That's the testing that's being used if you are symptomatic and you want to confirm whether or not you've got it or not. That's what's being rolled out to the country by the government at the moment, and is free to all, especially to key workers. So that's great, because it means that there is a test facility in place at the moment. But of course, as we move forward with what we've been discussing, the process or the mechanisms to manage the ongoing testing capability of people in the workplace is from our perspective anyway going to be potentially a bit of a gap. So that's why we started to evolve ways of dealing with antibody testing in the workplace, and also to provide a means of tracking and tracing the status of employees in the workplace too. So we're working with a technology firm to develop an app that businesses can access to manage that too. So in a small way, our efforts have been about trying to put in place additional means as an occupational health provider to not only add to the armory of resources that businesses can use around testing, but also to put in place a means of monitoring the status of people easily from within the workplace. So if people do want to know about that, they can contact us, and we can keep them up to date with where we are with it. So, given that these are the types of measures we're putting in place, and businesses are starting to look at the simple steps they can take in line with COVID secure, and we understand a little bit about the long-term position around the virus, the fact that it's not going to go away anytime soon, but we're hopeful there'll be a vaccine that will be on the horizon. I guess really it's going to be about, well, businesses are going to want to continue to understand that position and think about how they continue to manage the overall health and well-being of their employees in that context. Do you think there's going to be a shift in emphasis around what employees expect of their employers because of the experience of COVID-19 and the furloughing process and the pandemic? Do you think there's going to be a mindset shift around what people want and expect from employers around provisions for health and well-being in the workplace because of what's happened in the last 4 or 5 months?
That's a really interesting question. I guess there are there are more than one level to that. I think from the point of view of safety and workplace security, I think employees are going to be pretty hard with their employers. I think they're going to want to see evidence that as much as possible has been done to keep the workplace secure. And they're going to be critical if they come into work and feel that the social distancing is not being enforced, that there are insufficient biosecurity measures taken, so there's insufficient hand washing facilities, or the washroom facilities are not clean enough and are not maintained hygienically enough, and they're perhaps, in terms of mass catering, if they're looking at canteen facilities, if employees feel that not enough has been done to maximize the opportunity to maintain them in a healthy state, I think they'll be critical, and I think they'll feed back what they feel to their employees very actively, to their employers very actively, to say, look, I can't work in this environment, because we know from our experience working with companies and employees during the lockdown that it's not straightforward. There are many employees out there who have health conditions of their own, or who are living with people who are shielding, and living in families where one or more people have got health conditions which could potentially have a very severe, if not fatal, outcome if they get COVID. And they're worried about that. They're nervous about the potential to come back to work and bring an infection home and then cause difficulties for their own family's health. So I think from the point of view of how employees interact with their employers, I think they're going to be more demanding. I think they're going to expect as much support as they ever got, but potentially more. We're pretty certain there's going to be an upsurge in mental health problems as a consequence of lockdown, as a consequence of all the anxiety and fear that is present in society at the moment due to COVID. And that's only going to play itself out in the workplace, naturally, because that's where people spend a significant proportion of their day. It'll play out at home as well, but I think the risk is that people who have suffered from a mental health perspective during the lockdown will bring that to the workplace with them, and they'll find it difficult to leave it behind and just get on as if life was normal again, because life isn't going to be normal again, and those anxieties will remain. So so employees, I think, are going to be demanding. I think there's going to be more mental health problems, and that will cause the same sorts of problems that it always has, maintaining a reliable and sort of regular attendance at work and sort of good productivity at work. And then I think employers are probably going to have to ask these questions of their staff a little bit more actively than they did before, and try to work collaboratively with them to develop systems and processes and practices which reassures the employees that they are COVID secure, and that they're demonstrating COVID secure habits and COVID secure processes, and that the workplace is somewhere that the employees can come confidently to work without the risk of picking up the COVID infection.
Yeah, and I guess that's a really nice summary, I think, of probably where we are at the end of this 12-week series of chats that we've been having. Actually, just listening to you there, it kind of wraps up an awful lot of what we've been discussing in the last 12 weeks. And without wanting to scaremonger, of course, the other issue that businesses are going to face, and we've started to get communication from, local lawyers around, what is the risk in the workplace. And I think this is uncharted territory in terms of, what does happen if measures aren't in place in the workplace, and then people do pick up infections in the workplace because certain measures have not been put in place. Dare I say it, people have neglected their responsibilities to being COVID secure in line with the regulations. Someone goes home and unfortunately they may not survive. I mean, that's the worst case scenario. So I guess if nothing else is starting to bring the responsibilities of business leaders to the forefront of their mind, it's their responsibility to individual people who could actually pick up the infection in the workplace and may not survive. So it is a serious point, and it's one that businesses do need to address and put in place the right measures and follow the right guidance, and also to respond to the expectations of employees so that they feel secure themselves in all the measures. And I guess, like all occupational health, we would be saying to businesses, so long as you can evidence the fact that you've put the measures in place, and you can demonstrate that you've taken steps to put in place the guidance, then whatever the worst case or anything in between that should occur, you're able to demonstrate that you've done what you need to do to look after your employees, which fundamentally is the most important thing.
Yeah, don't forget that it all begins with a risk assessment, because you can't evidence that you've done the right thing unless you evidence the fact that you did an assessment to decide what the right thing was. And so the key thing for absolutely every organization that has an employee base, is to say, okay, what's the risk? Where do we see the problems? How can we mitigate that? What actions can we take to protect our staff? And then put those in place and review it. Come back, every 3, 6, 12 months, come back and review the risk assessment. Is it still watertight? Is it still appropriate? Given what we now know about this virus, and let's face it, as you mentioned earlier, the guidance is changing every few weeks. We're learning more, we're finding out what works, we're finding out what doesn't work, we're understanding better how contagious it is, we're understanding better what the R number means, all of these issues, which when we first got COVID in this country at the start of 2020, we didn't understand any of that. Well, it is going to change. And so an employer doing their risk assessment now, absolutely perfect. Do it. Make sure that you put the right changes and right processes and systems in place to keep your employees secure. But please come back to it and have another look. If things change, if for instance, the social restrictions on distancing change and it now becomes a meter or less than a meter, and then it becomes you can bubble with more than one person, whatever it might be, you look at your risk assessment, you say, well, okay, is that appropriate anymore? If it isn't, let's change it. Let's update it. Let's revise what we're doing to make sure that we're just on the ball with it as often as we can be, because there's little risk of criticism if you've done that. Whereas if you haven't done that and you've just simply provided some hand wash and gel and you've thrown out a few masks on the shop floor, that just isn't good enough.
Yeah, perfect.
And it's not going to cut any ice, is it?
And we would say if anybody is stuck or they want some advice and guidance, whilst we're not a consultancy firm per se, we provide clinical support services to businesses. There's a lot of expertise in MPH Group that we can draw on to provide businesses with all the help they need, and they can access us very easily by just picking up the phone and dropping us an email. So
absolutely, and it may be just a very simple conversation with a few pointers that say, look, we really think you ought to be thinking about this. Why don't you have a look at this guidance? Go away and have a think about the risks in the workplace. If you need some help, of course, we can come in and do an assessment on site. We can just simply have a Zoom. We can talk about the risks to staff. We can talk about how management might want to approach those. There's an awful lot of advice and guidance that we can give, simply, as you say, not as a consultancy, but as a clinical provider.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Okay. Well, look, I think that probably covers most of the key points that people will want to take away, and hopefully that timing works and gives people what they need today. And it's a brilliant way to wrap up our 12-week series. So thank you very much for all of your time over the last 12 weeks, Mark. It's been really interesting. I've certainly enjoyed having the chats with you. And I've no doubt we'll come back to doing many more of these and develop a new series fairly soon. So just to remind people again, on the end of July, the 30th of July, we've got Lizzie Simmons, who's a British Olympic swimmer, coming on board to give us a really upbeat, positive opportunity to talk about all the good things we can be doing to look after our own personal health and well-being. So look forward to that and watch out for our invites via social media, and you'd be very welcome to join us. So until then, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Okay. Bye.